January 31st, 1993. Amarillo, Texas. The wife and daughter of 39-year-old David Lewis return home from a weekend trip and discover that David is not at the house and has left his watch and wedding ring behind. David's abandoned car is soon discovered in the downtown area with his identification and many other personal items inside, but even though investigators turn up a series of bizarre clues surrounding David's disappearance, they are unable to find him. 11 years later, David is positively identified as a John Doe who was fatally struck by a vehicle on a highway in Yakima County, Washington, one day after he originally went missing. However, the exact circumstances of how and why David traveled nearly 1,600 miles to that location remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a doozy of a mystery to cover today. The unexplained 1993 death of David Lewis. And I'll say this right up front. If I was to compile a list of the top 5 most baffling cases I've ever featured on this podcast, this one would probably be on it. This is a pretty unique situation, as I actually rearranged my original episode schedule in order to cover this story, as it's become one of my most highly requested cases in a very short amount of time. Last month, a poster under the username Bridgeori published a post about an obscure cold case at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which I'm always referencing on this show. Well, it wasn't long before someone tagged me in the comments section and wrote, "Paging Robin Warder and the trail went cold," and over the next few weeks, I started receiving a number of emails, messages, and posts in my Facebook discussion group from people who suggested I do an episode about this, because quite frankly, it's the type of mystery this podcast was made for. I had personally never even heard of this case before that Reddit post went up, but it's since become one of the most intriguing rabbit holes I've ever gone down. It involves an attorney named David Lewis, who lived a seemingly ordinary life with his wife and daughter in Amarillo, Texas, until he vanished without explanation from his home. The investigation turned up some pretty bizarre clues which only raised more questions, but there was no hard evidence to suggest he had become a victim of foul play, and the authorities were inclined to believe that David left of his own volition. Well, there would be no answers until 2004, when DNA testing identified David as a John Doe who had been fatally struck by a vehicle nearly 1,600 miles away in Yakima County, Washington. What's even more incredible is that this incident took place just over 24 hours after he was discovered to be missing, so how did David wind up there to begin with? To add to the mystery, the vehicle which struck David was never found, so we still don't know if his death was an accidental hit and run from a stranger who fled the scene, or an intentional homicide. I've always had a particular fascination with cases in which someone is found dead a great distance away from their home, at a location they had no reason to be at, but this definitely ranks as one of the weirdest examples I've ever come across. No matter how hard you try, it's really difficult to come up with a concrete theory about what happened, which makes 100% complete sense, but I will do my best on this episode. Also, I need to give a shout out to a poster under the username Mimi on the Bayou, who claimed to have personally known David and his family, and left a number of interesting comments on the aforementioned Reddit post, which provided some additional insight into this case, and I talked with her and received permission to share some of that info here. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unexplained death of David Lewis. Our story begins in Amarillo, Texas in 1993, and our central figure is 39-year-old David Glenn Lewis. David lives with his wife Karen and their 9-year-old daughter Lauren, and the couple have been married for 11 and a half years. He is currently working as an attorney at the law firm Buckner, Lara, and Swindell, and had previously served 4 years as an elected county court-at-law judge in Moore County. He also teaches a government class at Amarillo College, and is known for being a very active member of his community and his church, who also does a lot of volunteer work for charity. On Thursday, January the 28th, Karen and Lauren decided to travel to Dallas for a weekend shopping trip. Since David had already gone to work at his law firm that morning, he did not see his family off, but at around noon, he told his co-workers he wasn't feeling well and decided to leave and go home early. In spite of this, David still showed up to teach his class at Amarillo College that night until 10 p.m. But over the course of the next 3 days, something would happen to place David at the center of a bizarre unsolved mystery. Karen and Lauren returned home to Amarillo during the late evening hours of January the 31st, which also happened to be Super Bowl Sunday. They expected David to have spent the evening watching the game, as it featured the Dallas Cowboys taking on the Buffalo Bills at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California. But when Karen and Lauren arrived at the house, they were surprised to discover that even though the lights and the television were still on, David was not there. By this point, the Super Bowl was over, but David had used the VCR to tape it, though instead of presetting a timer, he apparently put a VHS tape into the VCR at the start of the game and pressed record. Karen discovered that David's watch and wedding ring were on the kitchen counter, 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches were inside the refrigerator, and there was also laundry in the dryer. Since David's red Ford Explorer was not at the house, Karen assumed that he'd either gone to watch the game at a friend's house and would return, or he was working late and would spend the night at the office because he had an appointment in the morning. Well, David never returned home, and when Karen learned that he missed 2 work-related appointments he had scheduled the following day, she became concerned and contacted the Amarillo Police Department to report him missing. On February the 2nd, police discovered David's abandoned Ford Explorer, which was parked in the downtown area outside the Potter County Courts building. David's house keys and vehicle keys were underneath a floor mat, and a number of his personal items, including his driver's license, credit cards, and checkbook, were also inside the vehicle. Technically, the only items of David's which seemed to be missing from his house and could not be accounted for were a sweatsuit and a pair of tennis shoes. When investigators attempted to backtrack David's movements on the days prior to his disappearance, this only led to more confusion. On Friday, January the 29th, an acquaintance of David's, who knew him from his former hometown of Dumas, claimed that he saw David hurrying through the Southwest Airlines terminal at Amarillo International Airport, and he was not carrying any luggage at the time. At around 10:30 p.m. that same evening, a police officer claimed that they remembered seeing David's red Ford Explorer parked outside the Potter County Courts building, but the vehicle was apparently not there on Saturday, January the 30th, and at least one neighbor recalled seeing the Explorer parked at David's house that day. In addition, it turned out that $5,000 was deposited into David's bank account on the 30th. Apparently, the last confirmed sighting of David took place on the 30th as well, and while law enforcement never publicly disclosed any specific details about this sighting, I will be providing more information about it later on. On the morning of Sunday, January the 31st, a sheriff's deputy said he saw the Explorer parked outside the Potter County Courts building again, and this time, he noticed that a man resembling David was standing across the street and taking photographs of the vehicle. The confusion escalated when investigators discovered that plane tickets for 2 separate flights on 2 separate days had been purchased under David's name. The first ticket was purchased on January the 31st, the same day David was discovered to be missing, but oddly, it was for a flight from Dallas to Amarillo. The second ticket was for a flight on February the 1st from Los Angeles International Airport to Dallas. If that wasn't strange enough, a Dallas cab driver would later come forward and claim that on February the 1st, he picked up a man matching David's description from a hotel and drove him to the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The driver said the man appeared to be nervous and went through a wad of $100 bills when he paid him. According to Karen Lewis, shortly before he went missing, David had told her that he felt like he might be in danger, but he would not elaborate on this. Well, only a few days after he disappeared, David was scheduled to travel to Dallas in order to give a deposition in a $3 million conflict of interest lawsuit. A law firm which David had previously worked for was being sued by one of their former clients, a wealthy engine additive promoter David had once represented. During a conversation with his father, David implied that his former firm had committed some wrongdoings, but made it clear that he was not going to help cover anything up and stated, quote, "I'm going to tell the truth, whoever it hurts." David was the last person scheduled to give a deposition in this lawsuit, but according to Karen, all the files he kept on the case also happened to go missing at the same time he did. However, David's own attorney stated that the case in question had no personal liability and everything was covered by insurance, so he found it unlikely that David would have taken off to avoid testifying. In addition, another notable client David had once represented was Norbert Schlegel, the former father-in-law of a convicted murderer named Bobby Templin. Templin was in prison for killing his wife and had filed a lawsuit against Schlegel, but he later withdrew it, and since Templin was still incarcerated at the time David went missing, most people believed that case had no connection to his disappearance. Even though David's family and friends believed that he was abducted, there was no sign of any struggle or violence at his house, and the authorities could not turn up any evidence of foul play, so they were inclined to believe that David disappeared voluntarily. Since business at David's law firm was slow at that time, and he had lost a race for 69th District County Judge, they wondered if he might have become depressed and ran away. There was even some tension between Karen and the lead detective on the case because she refused to take a polygraph test. Even though the Amarillo Special Crimes Unit opened up an investigation into the case, they canceled it within a year due to lack of progress. David's story soon faded from the spotlight, though a local newspaper article was published about the case in 2002, where the Amarillo PD publicly expressed their belief that David was not a victim of foul play and that he left on his own accord. Well, within 2 years, there would be a very unexpected development. In 2004, Pat Ditter, a detective from the Yakima office of the Washington State Patrol, read a series of articles in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer which critiqued how law enforcement often mishandled missing persons cases. Even though the National Crime Information Center, aka NCIC, had a database which could be used to link unsolved missing persons cases with unidentified human remains, it was deemed to be ineffective since individual police departments often failed to share information and cooperate with each other. As a result, Ditter felt inspired to explore the idea of using the internet as a tool to potentially solve some local cold cases from the area. Ditter was particularly intrigued by an 11-year-old case from Yakima County involving an unidentified John Doe. Shortly before 10:30 p.m. on February the 1st, 1993, some motorists driving on State Route 24 saw a man walking down the center of the highway at a location just outside the town of Moxie and about 10 miles away from the local airport, Yakima Air Terminal. When these motorists decided to turn around to go check on the man, they discovered that he was now lying dead in the middle of the road. His cause of death was determined to be a hit and run, but while there were no eyewitnesses who actually saw a vehicle strike this man, there were reports of what appeared to be a Chevrolet Camaro speeding away from the scene. The victim was wearing what was described as Army surplus clothing and work boots, but there were no traces of alcohol or drugs in his system. Since he was not carrying any identification, the local authorities were unable to figure out who he was, so he would remain a John Doe for over a decade. Well, Detective Ditter decided to type this man's vital statistics into Google to see if he could find any missing persons who matched his description. Sure enough, within a week, he came across profiles for David Lewis on both the Doe Network and the Texas Department of Public Safety Missing Persons website. Even though David fit the profile of the victim in many ways, Ditter was a bit skeptical at first because David was wearing a distinct pair of thick eyeglasses in his photo, whereas the John Doe had not. However, after searching the victim's original clothing, Ditter soon found an identical pair of glasses which he had been carrying in his pocket at the time he was killed, convincing Ditter that David and the John Doe were the same person. Ditter got in touch with the Amarillo PD and sent them one of John Doe's boots, along with a tissue sample which had been preserved, so that DNA could be extracted. David's mother was soon contacted and asked to provide a sample of her own DNA for comparison, which would be provided to the University of North Texas Health Science Center for analysis. On October the 9th, it was officially announced that DNA testing had positively identified David Lewis as the John Doe, so his body was returned to Texas for a proper funeral service and burial. However, even though David was no longer a missing person, this only opened up a lot of unanswered questions about how he was able to travel from Amarillo to Yakima County to begin with, as the trip was nearly 1,600 miles and David did not have any known ties to the area. His family was convinced he had been abducted and taken to that destination and possibly forced to take an hallucinogenic drug before he was pushed out into traffic on State Route 24 and subsequently killed. In spite of this, a new investigation into David's death would not be opened, so the exact circumstances of how he traveled to Washington State and wound up dead continue to remain an unsolved mystery. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So yeah, if you were to look up the word befuddled in the dictionary, there's a good chance you might find a photograph of my reaction shot when I first read up on this case. Like I mentioned in the intro, this podcast has covered quite a few mysteries about people who inexplicably traveled a great distance and wound up dead under bizarre circumstances at a location they had no connection to. For a few examples, there's Blair Adams taking a cross-country trip from British Columbia to Knoxville, Tennessee, before he was found dead from a violent blow to the stomach. There's Judy Smith going missing on a business trip to Philadelphia before skeletal remains were discovered on a remote mountain in North Carolina months later. And of course, there's Jonathan Luna leaving his office in Baltimore one night and spending several hours driving hundreds of miles through multiple states before he was found stabbed 36 times in a rural creek in Pennsylvania early the next morning. But this one, it just makes no sense whatsoever. With Blair Adams and Jonathan Luna, you could at least track their movements and figure out how they got from point A to point B before they died. However, with David Lewis, we have him showing up at a location nearly 1,600 miles away from his home and being killed just over 24 hours after his family noticed he was missing, and no one knows how he got there. Anyway, now I want to talk about some information which was shared in various comments by the aforementioned Reddit poster Mimi on the Bayou, who knew the Lewis family personally. The original newspaper articles about David's disappearance described him as an all-around nice guy who was very well liked and respected, and Mimi on the Bayou pretty much confirmed that, describing him as an honest, morally upstanding person who always did the right thing and was incredibly devoted to his wife and daughter. In other words, he seemed like the last guy in the world who would have run off and abandoned his family. One of the most interesting pieces of information that Mimi on the Bayou shared, which isn't mentioned in any of the news articles about this case, is the last confirmed sighting of David on Saturday, January the 30th. We know that $5,000 was deposited into his bank account that day, but David also withdrew $50 before he went to look at a used basketball goal to buy for his daughter Lauren, as her birthday was the following week. He ultimately told the seller that he wanted to wait until his wife returned home before he decided to purchase the item, but he would be in touch again on Monday. Well, obviously, David went missing before this could happen, but these really do not seem like the actions of a man who was planning to run away. If David knew he was leaving, he either would have bought the basketball goal and left it behind for Lauren, or never bothered inquiring about it in the first place. It sounds like David's loved ones were continually frustrated by the fact that the Amarillo Police Department seemed convinced that he disappeared voluntarily. At one point, they apparently tried to imply that David had run off with another woman, which no one who knew him believed for a second. I know it might seem suspicious that Karen refused to take a polygraph test, but attorneys will often advise their clients not to take one even if they're completely innocent, due to their unreliability. By all accounts, Karen was left completely devastated by her husband's disappearance, so even though she was out of town the entire weekend he went missing, I don't see any reason to believe that she arranged for him to disappear while she was gone. Given that the local authorities ultimately seemed to give up on the investigation, I think there's a good chance that David would still be an unidentified John Doe in Yakima County to this day, if not for the initiative of Detective Pat Diller to use the internet to solve this case. Online sleuthing is a relatively common practice today, and has led to a number of unidentified John and Jane Does getting their name back, but in 2004, the Doe network had only been around for a couple of years, and I'm sure many investigators had not even considered the possibility of using it to match decedents to missing persons. And incidentally, it's quite amusing to see some of the original articles about David's identification specifically refer to Google as a quote-unquote widely used internet search engine, since Google wasn't quite the larger-than-life entity that it is right now. Anyway, one theory which has been pushed forward is that David's death was an elaborate suicide, and that he traveled nearly 1,600 miles to another section of the country where he made the intentional decision to walk into the middle of a busy highway and end his own life. That might sound unlikely, but it is not unprecedented, and in these types of stories, I always make mention of the Gail Delano case from Unsolved Mysteries. In case you're not familiar with it, Gail Delano vanished from her hometown in Maine after deliberately staging her own disappearance and traveling to Mobile, Alabama, where she checked into a hotel under an assumed name and overdosed on pills. She remained an unidentified Jane Doe for 2 years before she was identified, but it was apparent that she did not want her loved ones to find out what happened to her. But the key difference is that Gail had a documented history of clinical depression and mental illness, whereas it doesn't look like anyone picked up any noticeable red flags with David, which might have compelled him to do something like that. For what it's worth, it sounds like Detective Diller never believed that David's death was a suicide, and I do think there are much more logical ways to end one's life than stepping out into traffic, as this act could possibly only leave you crippled or seriously brain damaged. But regardless of whether this was a suicide, accident, or an intentional homicide, whoever drove the car which struck David sped away from the scene without stopping, so technically, this is still an unsolved crime. I think that in order to make heads or tails of what happened here, we have to explore the timeline, which is all over the map. Now, I do think the fact that David went missing on the date of Super Bowl 27 is significant, because the Dallas Cowboys played that year and wound up winning, so the game was a pretty big deal in Texas, and if he was a fan, I'm sure David would have been compelled to watch it. Indeed, on the surface, the evidence does suggest that he was in the midst of watching the game before something happened. So there's been a bit of confusion about the taping of the Super Bowl, as some sources seem to imply that David's VCR had no preset function, but unless he had a very old model, I have a hard time believing that a VCR would not have had the option to set a timer to record something in 1993. Thankfully, Mimi on the Bayou did provide some clarification about this in her Reddit comments. While the game itself would have started at approximately 5:20 p.m. Central Time, the actual TV broadcast started at 5 p.m., and it turned out that the VHS tape started recording at the moment the players came out to take the field, which would have occurred at approximately 5:15. So this seems to imply that rather than setting a timer, David just put a tape inside the VCR and started recording at that moment. And that's a pretty important detail, because if David didn't record the game on a timer, he had to physically be at the house at 5:15 to press record. When Karen and Lauren returned home later that night, they apparently discovered that the VHS had automatically ejected from the VCR because it ran out of tape after recording for over 6 hours. The fact that the game was being recorded might imply that David stepped out that night and was planning to watch the game later. But I can tell you that back in the days of VCRs, I often taped major sporting events, even if I was watching them live at home, because if the event was good, I might want to go back and rewatch them at a later time. So even if David was planning to spend the whole night at home, I could still see him deciding to tape the game. The fact that 2 freshly made sandwiches were found inside the refrigerator implies that he was planning to eat them during the game, but there's one thing I've always wondered. Was David planning to eat both the sandwiches himself, or was the second sandwich for someone he invited over to the house that night who may have played a role in his disappearance? And also, why would David have placed laundry in the dryer if he was planning to take off? The one detail which might point to David leaving voluntarily is his watch and wedding ring being left behind on the counter, but I've seen 2 possible explanations offered for that. David could have either removed them to do the dishes or something, and never got the chance to put them back on, or someone else staged the scene and left those items there because they wanted to make it look like David ran off and abandoned his family. In fact, if you believe the staging theory, we can't even be 100% certain that David was the one who put the tape into the VCR to record the game. Now, the complicating factor is that there were some other odd events which took place that weekend prior to the Super Bowl. For starters, we have an acquaintance of David's who claimed they saw him hurrying through the terminal of Amarillo International Airport 2 days earlier on Friday, January the 29th. Of course, you could easily assume this witness was mistaken, but they did know David personally, and I think one thing which differentiates this case from others is that he wore a very distinct-looking pair of thick eyeglasses because of his poor eyesight. If you look at the one photograph of David which is available online, those glasses do stand out, which is one reason I'm willing to give the sightings of him a bit more credence than others. But as far as I can tell, I don't think there's any other account of David's movements on the 29th, aside from a police officer who thought he saw his Ford Explorer parked outside the Potter County Courts building in downtown Amarillo at around 10:30 p.m. that night. Since his wife and daughter left for Dallas the previous day, theoretically, David could have gone to the airport and made an impromptu trip somewhere on the 29th before returning to Amarillo that same day. When you read the newspaper accounts of $5,000 being deposited into David's bank account on January the 30th, they make it sound like they're not certain he actually did that, but if he also withdrew $50 to purchase a basketball goal, then I can only assume he deposited the $5,000 at the same time. It's still not clear to me if they considered this deposit to be anything out of the ordinary. Was this the typical amount for a paycheck David received from his law firm? Or did he somehow acquire this $5,000 through other means? Either way, if David was planning to disappear voluntarily and take a lengthy trip to Washington State, it's odd that he would only withdraw $50 and leave the rest of that money behind. After all, he left his credit cards and checkbook inside his car, so unless he had a lot of cash on him which no one knew about, how did he finance this trip? As far as I know, the only reported sighting of David on January the 31st was the sheriff's deputy who thought he saw him taking photographs of his Ford Explorer, which was parked outside the county courts building. Once again, we can't be 100% certain that person was David, but if he was wearing those thick, distinct glasses, that does lend a bit more credence to the sighting. The vehicle was ultimately discovered at that spot on February the 2nd, but it's unclear how long it had actually been parked there. It's also interesting that the sheriff's deputy sighting took place in the morning, which means that if David did park the Explorer there, he then made the inexplicable decision to leave all of his personal items, including his house keys, inside, take photographs of the vehicle, and then return back home in order to tape the Super Bowl after 5 p.m. None of this makes any sense at all, unless someone was intentionally attempting to create misdirection by staging all these scenes. If this whole situation wasn't baffling enough, it's further complicated by the discovery of the 2 plane tickets which were purchased in David's name, and neither of them were for flights to Washington State, the location he ultimately wound up. In both these cases, law enforcement never publicly released the departure times or payment method for either of these tickets, and it's unclear if they were actually used. The first ticket, for a flight from Dallas to Amarillo on January the 31st, is particularly confusing. We do have a sighting of David at the Amarillo airport on the 29th, an apparent sighting of him in Amarillo on the 30th, and evidence which suggests he was at home in Amarillo on the evening of the 31st, so when did he make a trip to Dallas? Dallas is around 365 miles away from Amarillo, so it's not like it's exactly a short journey. It's also interesting how David's wife and daughter took a flight from Dallas to Amarillo on that exact date, but there's really no reason for David himself to be there at all. Things get even stranger when you factor in the second ticket purchased in David's name, which was for a flight from Los Angeles to Dallas on February the 1st. While we have a sighting from a cab driver who thought he had David as a passenger in Dallas on that same day, the problem is that he drove David to the airport. If this ticket had been for a flight from Dallas to Los Angeles, then it would make a bit more sense, as he may have needed to catch a connecting flight in LA in order to travel to Yakima, but neither of the tickets match the timeline of David's known movements at all. I don't know if there is any significance to this, but it's worth mentioning that Super Bowl 27 took place at the Rose Bowl, which is about a 30-minute drive from Los Angeles International Airport, but otherwise, I don't see how LA fits into this narrative. However, before you place too much relevance on these tickets, you have to remember that this took place 8 years before 9/11, when the world of air travel was so much different. Back then, you did not need identification to purchase plane tickets, so that might explain why the authorities never found any paper trail of David boarding a flight to Washington State, as he very well could have bought those tickets under a fake name or not used any name at all. In fact, since David Lewis is not an uncommon name, it's possible those 2 tickets were purchased by an entirely different David Lewis and have no relevance at all. And since we have no idea if those tickets were actually used, it's also possible that purchasing them was an intentional act of misdirection in order to throw everyone for a loop. It's also worth noting that even though the location where David was killed was only about 10 miles away from the Yakima Air Terminal, it's a pretty small-scale airport, so if David traveled there from Amarillo, he likely would have had to make a connecting flight from somewhere else, like Seattle. But if we put aside the possibility of flying, how long would it have taken for David to drive from Amarillo to Yakima County? Well, at a minimum, it would have taken at least 24 hours. If you believe David was the one who pushed record on the VCR at his house at around 5:15 p.m. Central Time on the 31st, then that means he would have had to make it to that location in Yakima County by 10:30 p.m. Pacific Time the following evening. Well, it's not impossible to make that trip by vehicle during that time frame. It would have been tight, and he would not have been able to take much time to rest. And of course, we know David's Ford Explorer was left behind in Amarillo, so what would he have driven? I suppose the other option is that he could have hopped onto a Greyhound bus, but they generally take layovers on trips which are that lengthy, so I'm not sure he would have made it all the way to Yakima County by that point in time. And even if David hitchhiked, I seriously doubt that any motorist who gave him a lift would have been willing to drive him that entire route during that time frame. Of course, the other detail which throws everyone for a loop are the Army surplus fatigues and work boots David was wearing at the time he was killed, as he apparently did not own any clothing matching that description. David was also known for dressing up very nicely whenever he went out in public, and since the only items of clothing which appeared to be missing from his home were a sweatsuit and tennis shoes, This seems to suggest he had no intention of going anywhere that night. Apparently, when the local authorities found David's body, they initially assumed he was a drifter because of the clothing he was wearing, but they were also thrown off by the fact that he had well-manicured hands. So where would David have obtained this clothing, and why was he wearing it? I mean, if David suffered some sort of mental breakdown and had been living as a drifter for a while, then it might make more sense that he was found wearing those clothes, but he had only been missing for just over 24 hours at this point. In online discussions about this case, I've seen a few people point out that David was killed in fairly close proximity to the Yakima Training Center, a U.S. Army installation which is nicknamed Yakistan because it features combat training in a dry, barren climate similar to places like Afghanistan, which helps prepare troops for overseas deployment. So if you believe David was the victim of foul play, perhaps dressing him in army fatigues was a deliberate act of misdirection intended to give off the false impression that he was a soldier who had gone AWOL from the training center. I mentioned earlier that David's family believed that someone abducted him and deliberately let him out onto the highway to be killed by oncoming traffic. Even though no traces of drugs or alcohol were found in David's system, they pushed forward the theory that his captors might have forced him to take some sort of weird hallucinogenic which was undetectable to toxicology screens. That way, David could have become so disoriented that he wandered out into traffic on his own, making his death look like an accident. It's also worth noting that while David had his thick glasses in his possession, he was not actually wearing them at the time he was killed, and when you consider the fact that he had bad eyesight, him walking down the middle of the road on a poorly lit highway sounds like a recipe for disaster. This abduction scenario might sound a bit over the top, but you also have to remember that even though Yakima Air Terminal was 10 miles away from where he was killed, even if David traveled there on his own and arrived by plane, that's still a long way for him to walk. That specific area was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, as the closest town, Moxie, only had a population of just over 800 people at that time. If no one else was involved in David's death, and he made the trip entirely on his own accord, he must have suffered one serious mental breakdown or been having major suicidal thoughts to wind up in this situation. The only lead they had on the vehicle which struck David were sightings of a Chevrolet Camaro driving away from the scene, but even so, we can't even be 100% certain that that was the same vehicle which hit him. If David was abducted, it's also possible that the responsible party dumped him out of the vehicle and intentionally ran him down themselves in order to make his death look like a hit-and-run accident. But it's also possible that the responsible motorist was a completely random stranger who legitimately struck David by accident, but had their own reasons for fleeing the scene and not pulling over to help him. I must say, if David was abducted and killed by someone, then this has to be one of the most insanely elaborate murder plots of all time. I can understand the logic of getting David far away from Amarillo before they killed him, so that it would be more difficult for law enforcement to make a connection between his death and whatever he may have become mixed up in. After all, this was 1993, so no one was thinking about stuff like the Doe network and online sleuthing on the internet, and were it not for the ambitious work of an enthusiastic Washington State Patrol detective, it's likely that David would still be a missing person to this day. However, taking him nearly 1,600 miles to Washington State seems like overkill. Instead of arranging for David to be fatally struck by a vehicle on a highway, why not just kill him and dispose of his body somewhere? It's possible that some of the weirder details of this case, such as the plane tickets being purchased in David's name, and his Ford Explorer being abandoned in downtown Amarillo, were staged in order to give off the false impression that he ran off voluntarily, but that cover story works a lot better when the victim is never found. What purpose would it serve to dress David in clothing which did not even belong to him and make a public spectacle out of his death? If this was murder, the responsible party did not come up with the most logical way to do it, and that also opens up another unanswered question. Who would have the motive for something like this? Well, shortly before he went missing, David did tell his wife that he felt like he might be in danger, but provided no specific details. A lot of stock has been put into the fact that David was scheduled to travel to Dallas to testify in a deposition for a lawsuit a few days after he disappeared, which is especially interesting when you consider that both the plane tickets purchased under his name involved flights to and from Dallas, and there was even a sighting of him in a taxicab in Dallas on Monday, February the 1st. The driver said the passenger looked nervous and had a wad of $100 bills on him, so if this man was David, then perhaps he did travel to Dallas on his own and was using cash in order to avoid leaving a paper trail. In fact, maybe he purchased those plane tickets himself to deliberately throw the people who were after him off the track while he traveled to Washington, though if that was his strategy, it is odd that he wouldn't actually buy a ticket under his name for any flights which actually left Amarillo. Since David was so devoted to his family, he may have felt that taking off while they were away for the weekend and not telling them where he was going might have been the best way to protect them from whatever he was involved in. According to Karen Lewis, David's files about this lawsuit went missing around the same time he did, which would seemingly lend credence to the idea that the two events were connected. But David's personal attorney reiterated that the lawsuit itself was really not that serious, and even described it as a quote-unquote relatively insignificant case in the press. I know David stated that he was going to tell the truth during this deposition, no matter what the fallback, and it sounds like this totally reflects his reputation, but without knowing any more specific details about this lawsuit, I couldn't tell you if this was the type of thing that would be worth orchestrating an elaborate abduction and murder plot to silence someone. It's also worth mentioning that Karen claimed that David did receive some death threats during his time on the bench as a court-of-law judge in Moore County. Given his honest, by-the-book reputation, David had no qualms about sending people to prison for breaking the law, so he could have conceivably made some enemies who wanted revenge. But by this point, David had not served on the bench for a couple of years, so I'm not sure if anyone would have held a grudge against him that long. There's also a bizarre postscript to this story involving the disappearance of another man in Borger, Texas, the town where David was born. At around 9:30 p.m. on June the 21st, 1994, 47-year-old Johnny Lee Baker, a wealthy and prominent pharmacist, returned home from jogging and spoke to his son on the phone, but after this, he vanished without a trace. Johnny's personal possessions, including his wallet and credit cards, were left behind at the house, but here's the weirdest detail about this story. The only item which was missing was the garage door opener. Well, according to an article on a blog called I Did It for Jody, Johnny and David grew up together, and while it's unclear whether they were still in touch at the time they went missing, there was apparently local gossip about the two men running off together to Las Vegas. Anyway, there's virtually no other information out there about Johnny Lee Baker's disappearance, and other than the fact that he was once friends with David, there's probably no connection between the two cases, but the whole thing is practically a cherry on top this large sundae of weirdness. So let's just assume there was no foul play or any other outside party, and that David made the entire trip himself. How would this whole series of events have played out? Well, David would need to put a tape into the VCR in order to record the Super Bowl, make some sandwiches he never planned on eating before putting them in the fridge, removed his watch and wedding ring and placed them on the counter, and then left his house without bringing along any extra clothing or personal possessions. At some point before or after this, he would also have to abandon his car in downtown Amarillo near his workplace, leave both sets of keys, his identification, and credit cards inside, and then somehow make a nearly 1,600-mile trip to Yakima County without these items. Oh, and at some point, he has to get a hold of some Army surplus clothing and change into it, and when he arrives in Yakima County over 24 hours later, he decides to walk into the center of a highway in the middle of nowhere before he is fatally struck by a vehicle. When you sum up the whole thing like that, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? But then again, none of the victim's actions in the Blair Adams case made any sense either, but he had been exhibiting strange behavior prior to his death to suggest he had some sort of mental breakdown, so his actions probably made sense in his own mind. I have heard no stories about odd behavior on David's part prior to his disappearance, but his wife and daughter have been away for a few days, so he could have had some sort of breakdown after they left, which compelled him to make his lengthy journey. When Blair Adams made his cross-country trip from British Columbia to Knoxville, he was convinced he was being followed and that his life was in danger. It's possible he was suffering from paranoid delusions and no one was actually after him, but when he arrived in Knoxville, he crossed paths with some random strangers who killed him for completely unrelated reasons. It could have been a similar situation with David. He develops paranoid delusions and becomes convinced someone is trying to kill him, so he flees his hometown, leaving behind all of his identification and personal possessions, possibly because he thinks this will protect his family. Maybe he also elected to buy some plane tickets under his name, which he never planned on using, in hopes that the people who were after him would head in the wrong direction. When David arrives in Yakima County, he winds up being killed by a random hit-and-run driver, but that only occurs by pure chance, and his belief that someone was following him and trying to kill him is nothing but a fantasy which only existed in his own mind. While David had never exhibited any red flags to suggest possible mental illness, I would otherwise probably think this scenario was the most logical explanation. But I don't know, something just seems really off about this case, and there's so much which doesn't add up. If we could figure out exactly how David traveled to Yakima County, it might be easier to get a handle on what happened, but I just don't see how David could have wound up at that particular spot on the highway unless someone dropped him off there. I can definitely believe that David possibly stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to, and being the honest, morally upstanding guy that he was, someone decided that he needed to be killed in order to silence him. But once again, this just seems overly elaborate for a murder plot. I guess it's possible that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, and that David could have suffered some sort of mental breakdown which caused him to flee Amarillo, and even though no one was actually trying to kill him, he could have had a random encounter with the wrong person in Washington, which led to his death. As I mentioned in the intro, this is one of those cases where no matter how hard you might try to brainstorm a concrete theory about what happened, no scenario is going to make 100% complete sense. While I'm glad that David is no longer a missing person, and his family were able to get some answers about how he died and give him a proper burial, I'm sure the circumstances of how he was found only amplified their confusion, and it's sad that the authorities no longer seem to be conducting an active investigation to try and figure out what happened. But even though this case has pretty much been forgotten about for a while, perhaps that aforementioned Reddit post and this podcast episode might generate interest again, and answers could be found someday about this truly baffling mystery. Like I said earlier, even if David made that lengthy trip completely on his own, and his death was an accident, there is still someone out there who performed a hit and run and never faced consequences for it. So if you happen to have any information about the unexplained death of David Lewis, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we actually released an episode involving a fairly similar story to this one, though it's technically not unsolved. It involves a woman named Jody Roberts who went missing in 1985 and was discovered to be alive and living under a new identity 12 years later after suffering an apparent case of amnesia. And like David Lewis, Jody made an unexplained lengthy journey when she went missing, traveling all the way from Washington State to Colorado. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I would also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Jennifer D., Charles M., David Q., Shannon S., Danny, Kate M., D. Brito, and Amanda R. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I just wanted to mention that this coming Saturday, June the 6th, I will be participating in an all-day podcast-a-thon on the streaming platform Get Vocal, which runs from 10 a.m. until 10 p.m. Pacific Time, which for those of you like me on the East Coast, is 1 p.m. until 1 a.m. Eastern Time. Throughout the course of the day, a number of prominent podcasters, including myself, will be hosting their own individual live stream sessions in order to raise money for Tawny Plattis, a fellow podcaster who tragically lost her husband last year. My particular live stream session will take place at the end of the evening at 9:15 p.m. Pacific Time, aka 12:15 a.m. Eastern Time, and it will be titled Robin Reads Ridiculous Reviews, as I share some of the most absurd podcast reviews The Trail Went Cold has ever received since our inception. A raffle will also be held in which I will be giving away Trail Went Cold merchandise. Anyway, here's a promo with more information, which you'll also find in this episode's show notes. Have a listen.
We have all experienced loss or know someone who has. Unfortunately, some can relate to losing a spouse with chronic health concerns. On November 8, 2019, George Plattis, one half of the dynamic duo of the Dirty Bits podcast, lost his battle with multiple illnesses. His widow, Tawny, now must pick up the pieces left behind. Join us on Saturday, June 6, on the Get Vocal platform as various podcasters host a podcast-a-thon to support Tawny and the expenses she's incurred as a result of her loss. Let's show her what this community is made of. As a participant, you will have the opportunity to bid on merch packs and even a private Zoom call with some of your favorite podcasters. Best of all, you get to help someone in need. We hope we can count on you to be there. A link for the GoFundMe and more information about the podcast-a-thon will be found in the show notes below.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, and of course, the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. When you get a chance, I highly recommend checking out that post about the David Lewis case, which contains hundreds of comments and a lot of interesting discussion about potential theories. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.